People will be rolling in, but I want to go ahead and welcome everyone to this evening, morning. I'm not sure what time zones, afternoon, what time zones everyone's calling in from. Um, just a little bit of a context for our gathering tonight, or today. Um, over the last, say, 6 months, Ashton Arnoldy, who's here. If you haven't seen, well, you can see from his box here, his name's there. And I have been working on something which I think in a normal kind of academic setting would be, just referred to as a postgraduate research project, postdoc. Um, and I'm working at the Goetheanum in the youth department, the youth section, and it is a very unconventional institution for higher education, totally independent, um, doesn't grant directly accredited degrees, but there's research going on in the different departments um, and sections. Here we go. Here we go. Um, with normal methods of that are conventionally practiced in academic settings, but also, of course, there's a whole contemplative epistemology and orientation that this school is dedicated to, and and the project that Ashton and I were working on, it was a research project. Um, and it's kind of a place where these two worlds intersect, um, and that's what we're after we had the opportunity to work together intensely for 6 months, and there's a forthcoming book which kind of was the core focus of our time together, that was like a backbone of our discussions. We wanted to do something where we just opened the door to the workshop and shared with anyone who was interested. And that's what brings us to this evening. And we had been thinking to do it in person at the Goetheanum, but due to scheduling, it didn't work out. So it turns out we're having an online event, which is wonderful because people from also farther off are able to join. And yeah, so that's what this evening's about, is actually kind of sharing something that's been taking place actually just in a room with me and Ashton most of the time over the last 6 months, discussing ideas, sharing ideas, thinking through different concepts. And for tonight, the kind of structure that I want to offer is um, a little introduction to Ashton, and then how this ended up kind of unfolding. And then I'm going to invite Ashton if he would share a little bit about the research that he did before he came here. Um, and and then we could have a conversation, maybe Ashton and I, a little bit about what we were working on together, um, also from the background of his specialization. And then also to have questions or comments from any of you that want to join the conversation in conclusion. So that's what I hope we can navigate through tonight, and and I hope you can get a good idea of the research that Ashton's been involved in, and also what we've been working on more recently. So I first met Ashton in person in March, so just about 1 year ago, and you were here to participate in some of the events that were happening around the 100-year centenary of Rudolf Steiner's passing.
Hmm.
And you gave a little presentation in the youth section house here of your research. And I remember we had a brief exchange by the door. I was like, hey, if you want to work on something sometime, let me know. We don't have a lot of money, but we can often get together, room and board, and a good research project. And a couple months later, you were in Dornach, and we had this idea to do this together. And yeah, and actually, I hadn't read your dissertation before I invited you, and after having worked on this, I wasn't able to study the whole thing before tonight. But it was so great to go back and look at the references, common references that we work from and frameworks. Um, of course, which I knew from conversations that we had had before. Um, but your dissertation, you called Directionally Creator, Owen Barfield and the Future of History. And
Yeah.
I know this is like the worst question that anyone could ever ask someone who's worked so hard on such a deep manuscript. But would you share a little bit from your work with everyone here and where you're coming from um, as an introduction?
Of course. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nathaniel. Yeah, so just I had just defended my dissertation right before I came to the Goetheanum last year for the first time. And and so that was like wrapping up 8 years of being at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I did my master's there too in the same program, which is called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. It's a philosophy and religion program. And many people are drawn to that program out of sort of like existential need to better understand our current like circumstances as a human, as a species, as a human being. And so that was I guess that's what drew me to the program and really informed my research and what I focused on. And the idea of the evolution of consciousness is a big theme in that program. And not all of the professors think with it, but many of them do. And I was introduced to Barfield in that context, and I read his book Saving the Appearances, and just felt like it really. So like the kind of questions I was coming with were like how, like really kind of concerned with the ecological crisis and the various political challenges that we face. I was 24 when I first got there, and I'm 33 now. And I had also questions around spirituality. Like I had experience with psychedelics and like wanting to experience the spiritual world, but like how do you do that? And I just felt like Barfield's book Saving the Appearances was one of the, I mean, many texts like spoke to me during my studies, but that text really spoke to me and felt like it was sort of giving me orientation that I was seeking. And so that's why I decided to focus on Barfield's work. And so the dissertation is basically trying to bring Barfield into contemporary conversations around history and to make an argument for the possibility of a meta narrative in history, which is something that has come to be critiqued, in the last uh, I guess you could say 100 years, because Hegel, was one of the, uh, I guess, modern articulators of this idea. You could say it's like present in a mythological way prior to that. But so I was trying to articulate how Barfield's presentation of the evolution of consciousness is not just ideology in disguise. And I really was trying to show how he's sort of applying Goethe's method, where rather than kind of cooking up an abstract theory out of an analysis of uh, like what is empirically observed or experiments, the idea is that theory emerges from the facts when they are arranged in such a way that that theory can come forth. And so I felt that Barfield was doing this with his meta-narrative um, about the evolution of consciousness, and so that's like part of the a big part of the paper or the dissertation because um, otherwise, like if you can't provide a different way of thinking about theory, then it's just going to be dismissed as a colonial ideology. And so like I was also trying to think through things like that. But and that's kind of more like the academic side, I guess. But the reason why I felt so compelled to do it was because, well, I felt very compelled by his narrative. And so, for instance, like I went to prior to uh, coming to this philosophy and religion program, I went to, as many people, Westerners have, the Amazon rainforest and participated in ayahuasca ceremonies, trying to like ex have a kind of like immediate experience of the spiritual world, and was just sort of like destabilized by that and just confused by that whole experience. And so I felt like in Barfield's work, and that sort of led me to Steiner, was presented a way of understanding how human beings, and not all human beings, like in a complex way, even though we kind of share in this global culture today, have become so alienated from the natural world and the spirits that, once were experienced as bound up with that world, and how we could enter back into a relationship with that once again, but in ways that are maybe less potentially self-destructive. I don't think psychedelic use is inherently self-destructive, but um, so yes, I felt because of these sort of personal reasons and how like the necessity of developing that kind of relationship again out of a freedom where we're not dispensing with individuality and agency, how relevant that is for facing our challenges today as a species, with climate change and also politically. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, the dissertation and the motivations behind it. And there's, a lot more I could say about it because it's like 400 pages, but that's where I'll stop for now.
Okay. Um, yeah, and thank you. Yeah. You know, you you start the dissertation and you end the dissertation referring to this question of feeling a need to find orientation as a young person with idealism. You have this idealism, you want to do something meaningful, want something that's of service, but it's like hard to read how, what, and you, besides describing that, and particularly you bring up the characteristic challenges of the Anthropocene. Your experience in California, there are fires burning, then there's this pandemic, um, and this consciousness that there's this really yeah, global challenge. And how do you deal with that? And this is like a motivation for you. And then you also narrate in the beginning of your dissertation this experience that you had with psychedelics or through psychedelics. And at the end of the dissertation, you come back to this. And in a way, you reflect on your starting point and where you feel like you ended up, through your dissertation. Like, I set out with this search for orientation. And I don't know if you would say a few more words about this, but like one of the things that struck me was like it was like through being able to feel like there was some meaning that you could read in this process, also in some ways the suffering and the difficulties, it gave you a new perspective that really answered what you were looking for or came towards what you were looking for. You quote like refer to some of the criticisms of liberalism. um, you know what is it all about in the end, other than individual expression or freedom, when we really look at the bigger picture. And of course the dark philosophy of and interesting philosophy of Nick Land. um, and so I don't know, this process that you went on, would you say a little bit about the ending point, where you ended up? You started with this search and then your study of Barfield. And also there's this huge amount that you dedicate to Rudolf Steiner. I mean, because Barfield's work was so animated by his interest in anthroposophy and dedication, like you also explore all that. I don't know if you would say a few words about that, where you ended up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say, in many places, Barfield says things like, well, if you want to understand like what I mean by his phrase final participation, which is sort of this concept that he only uses in Saving the Appearances, but he's talking about in all of his other texts as well. Essentially, it's like this, and I think Goethe's method is an expression of this. He thought Steiner was like the sort of exemplar of this, is like um, having a relationship with the spiritual world and being able to read the world without dispensing with this sort of um, self-possessed subjective experience and capacity to make free decisions. And this is he says in many places in his text, if you want to understand this better, go check out Rudolf Steiner. And there's so much that's like suggested in his writing that I felt like I didn't that like lured me, but I was like mysterious, and I would eventually understand better when I did get into Steiner. And but in addition to, Barfield, in my during my studies, I read, a lot of classics and just got acquainted with the Western, especially the Western philosophical tradition, and also the centrality of Christianity in that. And I had already sort of like been readjusting my conception of Christianity because I grew up in Arkansas and I didn't have the best model of it, I guess. And so one thing that I discovered along the way of this process was just the way in which Charles Taylor really makes a compelling argument for this, among others, that our subjectivity is really contingent on the history of like self-understandings changing, and like we didn't just like come out of nowhere experiencing the world as we do, and that much of it is contingent upon ideas connected with Christianity and the notion of a transcendent divinity that like came in. And I guess it's Easter was last week, and this weekend is Greek Easter. But this whole event, of that Steiner refers to as the mystery of Golgotha, and the notion of Christ as the Logos. I just came into a deeper understanding of these things. I would say like a more sophisticated understanding, because I just kind of thought it was ridiculous that this idea that a human could become God, or that God would become a human, and these really important values that we have today, um, connected with liberalism. Like I use these terms, drawing from Taylor, universal justice and beneficence, like caring for your neighbor, essentially. And like that's actually, if you're a naturalist, that's kind of like not natural, to do that. And I mean, you can maybe make arguments for it, but you can't really, the existentialists, recognize that these are sort of absurd values, and the only justification for them, if there is no transcendent divinity, is only that we choose to continue to honor them. And but we're also like rational beings. And so anyway, I just came into a deeper understanding philosophically of the way in which even science, our assumption that the world is intelligible and is something that we can come to understand, is also grounded in the like the at least historical assumption that there's some kind of transcendent author. And also, I didn't talk about this in my dissertation, but I didn't really have any visions when I was in the Amazon. The only thing I did see a it was Christ. And so I didn't really know what to do with that at the time, but it took on a lot of significance when I discovered these thinkers, and also this way in which, for Steiner and Barfield and other thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin and seemingly Charles Taylor, that the Christ is like bound up with evolution in a way that's not simplistic or crude. And so and for me, this connects to, I guess, like I didn't really get a kind of map per se, like when it comes to orientation, aside from like trying to be awake in my heart, and how that can inform my negotiation of any given moment, and is also at at play in scientific inquiry and philosophy and everything else. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
Thank
that answered your question, but
Well, I think you opened a lot of good insights into your process through what you just shared. Thank you. Um, one of the things, so both of us in in the last 6 months, and also we were using this book that I have been working on, an aesthetic education for the Anthropocene, art, ecological consciousness, and associative economics as like the framework for our work together, and then reading different chapters and discussing them, also discussing the ideas and how they're presented, ultimately, finished, got the book into good form through that process. Thank you very much, Ashton. Um,
my
and
pleasure.
um, and one of the things that it's interesting because of course we weren't talking about these things before you came, but we both drew heavily methodologically, just in the academic world, on Charles Taylor, who is kind of, I think, probably the thinker who has done more for the Middle European kind of romantic, idealistic, intellectual heritage in the last decades than anyone else. In his studies of Hegel, but also you refer a lot to his book, Secular Age from 2007, this monumental study of the emergence of secularism. And one of the things that I think what you were just speaking about this relationship between the divine and the earth, and it connects to one of the concepts in Taylor that both of us worked with, related to modernity, is ultimately if the Christian um, orientation is connected to a deeper truth, it has a long way to go. Because the way Christianity has developed until now, it's led to what he calls this buffered experience of self, where there's really a separation from the spirit and the greater world, which has allowed for freedom, which he characterizes in various ways. But it's kind of an excarnated self. It's a self out of touch with the cosmos, so to say. And and this is something that I think plays an important role in your research before you came here. But then also, like, one of the things we were working on is how right now there are tendencies that are leading our consciousness away from the earth, actually. We think we live in a time where, with science, we're totally connected with the earth. But one of the ideas we're discussing is how science actually, the way it's commonly understood, actually is anesthetic. It actually leads our feeling and our perception away from science. So science without perception and without feeling, like, and how it leads towards a kind of utilitarian um, view of the meaning of life. And on the other hand, there's a kind of tendency to lead us away from the earth through expressivism, which is like self-expression, which is also in liberalism is one of the core values, the ability to direct your own life, meaning to be the author of your life, to express yourself. But paired with the digital revolution, it's kind of like we're all these expressing individuals in digital spaces often that really are out of touch with Earth, and leads to a kind of utopian expressivism is a concept that we developed. And I just wondered, this picture of trying to bring our consciousness actually more into an intimate union with the Earth as a, well, when you're speaking about Christianity just now, this connecting the logos and the Earth. That whole part of our work, which makes up, a significant part of the book, how do you see that connection and what do you think about that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I have thought like since we've worked together like what I was focused on and like presented is almost like background context for then like what you're providing, which is like, okay, now what? Like for our time and Nathaniel works with this term in his text which he refers to as aesthetic individuality, which is sort of, you could say, um, the way it's like a kind of a path to walk that doesn't go in these extreme directions, and but instead forges like contemplative relationship with the natural world, with economic processes, and also involves draws on Schiller's idea that cultivating like a culture that encourages the practice of aesthetic appreciation and art and the experience of play would be one that would promote free individuals who would, who would want to act honorably rather than have to be compelled in that direction. And so, um, yeah, I feel like, I said when you were asking me about like conclusion or introduction conclusion, kind of where I ended up, I described this sort of like general orientation, but there, I would say like the work that you were doing really relates to that in that we do need some kind of direction, like like for instance, like how do we realize a more just economy? Like we have to like really pay attention to the way our resources are produced and everything that goes into them and everything that, you know, all the connections that our everyday activities have. And that's not as like sexy as sexy as some other professors would say, as, just like kind of thinking about these things. But it's really kind of how I think the future of realizing the ideas would unfold. So that's, yeah, a few initial thoughts.
Mm. And one of the so like one of the things that we were, of course, like the title of the book that we were working through together is aesthetic education for the Anthropocene. It has this picture of a kind of comprehensive aesthetic education that's not only about art but also where science and economics are considered in aesthetic education. And um, so there's three disciplines of aesthetic education that we were talking about, and one of them you focus on. So you don't really focus on associative economics, but you do focus on Goethe, and you had explored already Goethe's notions of the Urphänomen, or the archetypal phenomenon, and you did it from the perspective of Barfield's idea of figuration. So, and how Goethe, through not reducing things, not going towards abstract hypothesis, but always trying to stay loyal and true to experience and perception, lifted up into consciousness what usually was unconscious figuration. In Barfield's term, if I'm reading your interpretation right, and that this was becoming conscious of these primordial natural creative processes like the archetypal plant, but also in physics, his theory of colors. And one of the things that is interesting is like this the concept of aesthetic education. I don't know if you have anything that you want to reflect on this about, but like one of the things that intrigued me also in our discussion was to reflect on how it's not only about another way of doing science, but it's a way of doing science that educates our feeling. And what
Mhm.
you were saying about Schiller, how art, if we have kind of a society where creative, playful, artistic culture is celebrated and cultivated in all areas of life and education, it's a great foundation for free individuals, but also tolerance of difference. So his kind of main thesis. And with Goethe, then the second part of this book is ecological consciousness through this type of figuration that you're talking about. So where the primary imagination becomes conscious, it also educates our feeling. And Goethe suggested, it makes us feel fear for the boundaries of ourselves and the sublime realities of the earth or the phenomenal world, and respect and resignation for these boundaries. When he described his experience of the archetypal phenomena. And so, like, it's kind of like a counter movement to Schiller. Schiller kind of creates this place of play and appearances where there's no feelings of boundaries. In fact, it's like self-expression, which is beautiful for cultivating a feeling for human dignity, I think. But then on the other hand, it's kind of a catastrophe ecologically. It's like because exactly the problems we're dealing with are that the earth is limited and there are things we can't just play away. And how to cultivate a feeling where we can sense that in our hearts and not just intellectually. Um, and this was something we talked about in your dissertation. You write about this, the digital revolution kind of has this one side where it connects us around the whole world. Um, you referred to McLuhan and this global village, picture that he described. Um, but how Schiller alone, he kind of he can't do all the work for us. And I don't know if there's anything from those conversations or the aesthetic education, like if I were to ask you, like, what is the aesthetic education component of Rudolf Steiner's Associative Economics, which was the third branch. I don't know what do you think about that or yeah.
Well, so about what do I think about in
The
particular?
aesthetic education component, this education of the heart in different ways than Schiller, because Schiller came up with the notion of aesthetic education, but
Yeah.
then only really focused on art. And yeah,
Yeah, well, because I guess for me, like, in what I wrote, I was really trying to draw out the way in which Goethe's method extended to the history of life, ends up, well, really dissolving these uh, divisions that have arisen with modernity between, the disciplines that study nature and the disciplines that study culture. And so Goethe's method extended ends up, you know, potentially providing us a way to enter into the story of cosmic evolution as theory, experienced. But and that it also has this becomes a kind of religious, like it has a religious dimension to it in that, as you describe, like it in gives us a sense of awe, like especially like when we're kind of more focused on Goethe's method and the perception of archetypal lawfulness as something that, is like appearing, but also exceeding those momentary appearances. And um, so there's that. And, with Steiner, like, he takes it even further. He's like, he's like, the more you sort of cultivate this particular process that he's outlines, like you start to like experience like spiritual beings, that, so there's that. But then, but then there's like the attunement to our practical existence and a comprehensive aesthetic education that would make us very, whereas now we're like many of us are alienated from and not even don't even think about all that goes into what's on my plate, or like what goes into me driving down the street. But um if Steiner's associative economic practice, which is also very has this social, like pro-social quality to it that's different maybe than what we get with Schiller, like we're like respecting the freedom of the other and their aesthetic self-display as drawing on like Hannah Arendt and Portman, right? Um, or maybe it's just Hannah Arendt, but instead it's like we're more, and I really felt this actually to some extent, like as much as we can practice it, like at the Goetheanum and like in connection with the youth section, like this like our common sharing in the earth, and like really like acknowledging and living out that we are all equal there, in the sense that like we all depend on the earth and maybe we have different capacities, but um and that there's something religious about that too, I think. Yeah, so yeah, really I think comprehensive aesthetic culture is a way beyond this disciplinary division as well, that has separated these different spheres of life.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I'm trying, I think there, of course, there's so much, and we had so many good conversations, and I'm wondering if the best way actually to invite, uh, I don't know, is there anything you want to just add out of your own, where you're sitting now, Ashton, from this experience, or any thoughts? I don't want to, I don't have to be the only one asking questions, but
Yeah, well, you know, I was really excited by this idea that I referenced earlier of yours, or just this like name for something that is sort of gestured at, but we don't necessarily have a name for it. Aesthetic individuality, as like a symbol to refer to like what arises when a human individual participates in the cultivation of these different capacities. And I mentioned Hannah Arendt, who you draw on a lot, and her idea of political life and like the importance of appearance, of self-display, and is something young people are participating in all the time with their construction of social media presence. So it's like something I think that's vital to, it's like important to us as human beings. Um, and just how this idea provides like a way of thinking about it, that meets that need. I think one of my former professors, Rick Tarnas, would talk about like the need to recover like this idea of the honor ethos, like of archaic society. And like the nobility in people who have managed to live this way and as models to imitate for those who are contemporaries with them or come after them. And so yeah, I don't if there's anything you want to say more about that, that's something I just found really compelling and exciting, and yeah, I appreciated about your book.
well, I mean, going back to the first thing I asked you, I think for me, what's so moving about what I feel like the book is exploring that motivated me to really want to write it too is this feeling of how to overcome the buffered self in a good way without losing freedom, but gaining actually uh, deeper connection with the earth, which is a connection with all of humanity, but also with our economic interdependence, but not in like a more way of moralizing about it or having a political platform, but as an education of consciousness or judgment, and judgment as distinct from reason. Reason has this kind of abstract, principled, clear, and this judgment, which is so connected with the idea of aesthetics, so that your heart is involved, that your imagination is involved in understanding economic interconnection. And when I discovered that Rudolf Steiner's associative economics was inspired by Goethe's method of morphology, which he clearly states in his economics course, and then I couldn't not see it in everything he wrote about economics. And I really felt how, Rudolf Steiner's most well known as a spiritual teacher today, I think, besides his practical influence through all the initiatives. but he also has this side of him that really focused on exploring how to cultivate judgments that can do justice to like economic value judgments and pricing, but not as a government policy, but as a capacity of individuals that is tinged by social feeling, and solidarity. And it really is so moving to me. Also, the warmth of it, also in a very challenging time. Right now we've got anything but warmth going on internationally, a lot of cold steel. And so I feel this picture of aesthetic individuality um, that is not only about art, but also there's distinct scientific practices which have really been, not only articulated, but practiced. I mean, at the Nature Institute, which a whole chapter is kind of dedicated to the work going on there, just as one example. And then associative economics, and who's heard of associative economics? But the fact is that some of the most prestigious awards that are being given out for alternative views and projects on economics today are going to places like Sekhem in Egypt that are inspired by this idea. One of the largest natural food stores chains in Germany, Alnatura, is inspired by this vision of economics and true price. And it's like this invisible presence of very worthy ideas. And what they all have in common, Schiller, Goethe, and Steiner, in art, science, and economics, is this interest in aesthetic judgment or sensorial understanding. So, a way of thinking that is really connected with perception. Um, and so, not the buffered self, not the self that is separated. But it's also not what Taylor refers to, the revels, the the Dionysian kind of
Yeah.
revels and carnival. But it's a kind of returning to the earth in a way, in a new way. So that's some of what I am inspired by in that concept. I think in political theory, is boringly called the theory of subjectivity. Um, um, but it's one that I'm very excited about, even though the term is boring. Yeah, and I know there's probably a number of very intelligent and interesting comments
Yeah.
and questions. Sorry, Ashton, go ahead.
No, I was just,
Yeah.
yes. Other people in the room, yeah.
So maybe we could just so anyway, just to conclude this part, basically Ashton and I, we worked through all the chapters of this book and had conversations about it. And I also asked for suggestions, but we talked about things that weren't clear. And the book hopefully will appear this year. It's right now in a process of peer review with the University Press in the United States. So more on that. But it is possible to access Ashton's dissertation presently for those of you who are interested. Ashton, would you put the link in the chat just for those people who might want to look at it?
Yeah.
Um, and then they can look that up right away if they're interested. But yeah, is there anyone who has a comment, a contribution, question? You are welcome.
I'm just remembering back to the early teens when I think, Nathaniel, you were involved with a social sculpture group in Upper New York. So I think that the social sculpture phenomenon was a good example of aesthetic individualism. It had aesthetic, economic, and social field awareness in a whole new combination. And I think that the there's a social sculpture college in England. I forget its name, but they arranged to put an exhibit in Dornoch at the Goetheanum. I think it was about 15 years ago. It was about bananas. So it was very, economic awareness was part of what was going on there. And it was received with very mixed a very mixed reaction. So whether the phenomenon of social sculpture is an example of aesthetic education or aesthetic individualism, I think it is. And I'm just hoping that with Barfield becoming more popular and his bringing our attention to literary history motifs that keep recurring, um, putting those two things together will, like the youth section, could you perhaps, with a group of young people, maybe Ashton and others who are looking for these trends. I'm also thinking of the classroom alive phenomenon. Remember that? That was threefold youth people, young people who started out in Järna, Sweden, and they hiked all the way to I think Athens, and they did videos and reports. These were all anthroposophical young people who were trying to do new things. So those are examples that come to mind of struggles in this direction.
We need some kind of website dedicated to like just reporting all these things or just collecting them. Because yeah, I've never heard of either of those. I mean, I know of like boys and social sculpture, but I didn't know you guys were doing something in New York back in the teens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they also they brought it into the art section. That's how I learned about it from Nathaniel posting in the art section. I wrote a few articles that were published in my local newspaper about what was going on there, trying to, the Yes Men, have you heard about them? They were
Yeah.
very popular social sculptors. I think they're still active in the USA. They show up and they do guerrilla theater here and there all the time, stuff like that. Yeah, so Nathaniel has that in his history. Maybe it's time to bubble it up again.
Well, the connection to social sculpture is super interesting. I mean, Joseph Beuys was really inspired by Rudolf Steiner's social theory. And those of you who are familiar with Beuys's work, his one of his most famous slogans was "Everyone is an artist." And that is, of course, a term that could mean everything or mean nothing, which is what provocative terms can do. But when you go into his work, what he was saying is that we need a society where what everyone is doing also economically is experienced as a contribution of their individuality. And they are intrinsically motivated to contribute it, be it a loaf of bread or a piece of music. So, and he was inspired by Rudolf Steiner, at least in part by Rudolf Steiner's idea that you shouldn't be able to sell labor, and that ultimately the economy should be a field of mutuality and voluntary cooperation where people are contributing to others' needs and having their needs met by one another. And this is like a very, very interesting backdrop to Boyce's concept that everyone is an artist, because it had actually at least one of its strongest inspirations was Rudolf Steiner's economic thought and the end of wagery. So, yeah, there's a real strong connection there with aesthetic individuality.
That's interesting to know. I mean, I knew Boys was influenced by Steiner, but I didn't know how much of it was connected with his economic theory and social theory. But it just makes so much sense because I remember when I was first reading about him and watching what you can of videos about of the events, like I was just struck. I was like, what, how is this art? Like but I was like excited by it. But it just, yeah, now it strikes me that like, what he was doing was like creating this sort of like disruption to the ordinary
Mhm.
movement of
Movement.
li cultural life and like trying to foster like the kind of attention and interconnection that um that this different way of life might would involve.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other comments or questions or contributions?
Well, hello. What comes to mind for me is working in agriculture is that this is a whole topic that is so connected to all of these things. I think about on what Manfred Klett used to say about agriculture, who was leading the agricultural section at the Goetheanum and a big farm in Germany for a long time, that selling labor is similar to selling land, and both is
Mhm.
wrong, was wrong all the time, and also in today's time, and also the pricing. So it's just a huge sector that also art can flow into, because he said we have to change this whole working field from being a working field into being just a fundamental piece of art that is a piece of art that everybody's eating and also living off, living from. Um, it's a strong contrast to how agriculture is practiced nowadays around the globe. And also, as a focus point of this topic, the individuality of agriculture is so extremely important for the people who do it, the people who eat the goods. Um, this personal connection that also Ashton
Yeah.
talked about, um, this personal connection that brings you into reality and out of the buffered self, in my opinion. That's what I was thinking about.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know I cut my video. So-
That's okay. We heard everything.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, that's so wonderful to hear your description, Noel. I think one of the things that we talked about also, Ashton and I, in our work in the last chapter, which is on associative economics, is how Rudolf Steiner makes the claim that land, labor, and capital should not be treated as commodities. And it's a really fascinating justification because it's not a moral justification. It's actually categorical. He basically goes through these different processes and shows how economic judgment is really being misplaced because it doesn't make any sense when you really think it through on examples. And he was really against moralizing an economy, like, oh, we should all love each other more, or let's all act selflessly. And he felt like you could get to solidarity and fraternity actually by expanding economic judgment culture because it was actually intrinsic to the modern economy. So he, um, in any case, your description is really was really on point. Some of the things we talked about in our work together, and another interesting thing that is connected to your field, Noel, is Ashton mentioned it also in his dissertation and also in this book. I actually go into it quite a bit because there's an author who's not an anthroposophist, but he's a researcher who's researched a lot about anthroposophy at Harvard named Dan McCannon. And he wrote one of his studies is called Eco-Alchemy, and he shows how the biodynamic movement really is one of the most important kind of dynamic catalyst points at the emergence of the modern environmental movement, the concept of farm individuality, but connected with it, all the ideas of associative economics He has a whole chapter about economics and about the land question, the labor question, and capital question. And and that's something, actually, one of the things that was really inspiring, because I was working through the ideas for this book just as ideas first, and then I read McCannon's work and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like almost like what I'm thinking, this is what happened in a way. And so I try to connect the theory of aesthetic individuality with what Dan discovered in his research. And I don't know if you've seen that book, but you might be interested in looking at it. And there's a lot of great interviews also with biodynamic farmers that you probably have heard of if you don't know them around the world. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. Great.
Ashton, was there anything to Noel that you came to your mind that you wanted to contribute?
Well, it's similar to when the discussion about boys came up because it just struck me that the idea of bringing art into agriculture is similar to, pre-modern agriculture, which wasn't just like like exclusively economic process, but was like a religious activity for
Yes.
many cultures. And I feel like there's something similar there, and where it's not just drudgery. And oh, there was something else. But yeah, that was just something that occurred to me. Just the way in which our usual conditioning when it comes to maybe not everybody, but these categories in modernity of life, the economy, art, science, religion, this is just a way to bring them back together, but not in a way that's just an anachronistic
Mm,
attempt to return.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, are there any other thoughts or yes, Harold?
Uh, can you hear me? I don't know if I.
Yes.
Okay. Um, Very interesting, all of it. Um, and you and I had a connection through Hannah Arendt as well as through anthroposophy. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to me for people to bring up Hannah Arendt. Um, I have a talk that's called Auschwitz, Evil, and the Industrialization of Death, which came out of my uh, anthroposophical group journey to Auschwitz in 2013. But in part of that talk, because I'm trying to determine who understands industrialization, I ask people in the audience, how many people have ever worked in a factory? And most of the time, I get one or two hands.
Mhm.
I was having a discussion with someone the other day who was, I won't go into the details of it, and I asked them, a young person, I said, well, have you ever worked on a farm? No. And if many people have not worked on a farm, what people's concept of farming, unless you're involved in biodynamics, uh, is machinery and all of the rest. And it's very interesting to me that what's going on now with uh, Bill buying up huge amounts of land, calling it sustainable agriculture. And what he's talking about is sustainable economically, in his view, economically. And there's no people involved. It's all, automation and the rest. And this is a major problem that there isn't the experience because we can talk about you can go to a museum and you can look at art, but unless you try to do something artistic yourself, you don't really have that experience. It's necessary. unless you've worked in a factory and know what it's like 8 hours a day. I worked in lots of factories. That's why it's important to me. Uh, you don't have that experience of the group and the product and what it takes to make the product. And unless you worked on a farm or involved in farming, you don't understand that relationship. And uh, there's a lot that one can learn. One of the things I learned, this is way before biodynamics or anything like that, was to taste the dirt. That's what a farmer taught me, how to taste the dirt and know what, based on the taste of the dirt, you needed to do to your land in order to grow. And when I was in 4-H, which I recommend highly to all, uh, we had an experimental garden. Uh, the seed companies would provide us with seeds. We would plant according to however our farming history. And my family came here in 1650, so we have a long history of agriculture and whatever. And so you had that experience of what it takes to grow, the apprehension when there's not enough rain. And as a consequence, you're on a well. And because you're on a well, you can't necessarily water. And what do? And then all of a sudden, you know, it's 1977 and I'm in Spring Valley and working with Dr. Scharf, may he rest in peace. And I find out that, if you use biodynamics, that lessens your concerns about the availability of water. The soil is able. So anyway, this, me, I go on and on and on. What I'm, my point is that we need, and I've said this to educators. I said one should not be able to graduate from high school unless they've worked on a farm and worked in a factory.
Yeah, I mean, it's really well, I mean, first of all, about Hannah Arendt, it would be so great to talk sometime more about that connection and also her beautiful study of the phenomenology of social life, and also how her concept of animal laborans in a way is redeemed through Rudolf Steiner's associative economics, because labor was really looked down on in ancient antiquity as a kind
Yeah.
of not really containing something of human dignity, and thus being really more appropriate for slaves and animals. Um, but through Rudolf Steiner's work, the whole field of labor is somehow lifted up, into fraternity, and it
Sure.
absolutely it's presented. And I mean, he did go into factories, as you well know, Harold.
Right.
Um, and it's presented as absolutely intricately connected with to continuing, so to say, the division of labor of the Industrial Revolution, but in taking away its antisocial um, dimensions. And I think that really it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner, I think he had a high faith in the imaginative judgment of people, and that if there was more communication about the value chains, even in complex modern economic processes, that people would be able to kind of temper their idiocy. Because right now I think we are pretty idiotic, generally speaking, about like economic reality, economic processes, from resource extraction to waste, and we're really blind on this planet, and yet we're totally consuming it every day. And I think Steiner thought through associations and more true price processes of judgment, which is the third branch of aesthetic individuality. You could actually, through your imagination alone, get a lot of those lessons that you got in person, Harold, when you were working on farms and in factories. Um, I don't want to, speak against your suggestion that people should work on a farm and in a factory before they get a diploma, but just referring back to the Steiner and
Sure.
his faith in the fact that you could be informed by someone else's experience.
Yes.
Someone else telling you what it's like on the factory floor could help you understand that you should consume less and pay more, maybe. You know? Yeah. And Ashton, did you have any thoughts for Harold? Anything from what he shared, or?
Maybe just a yeah, a thought that I feel like kind of extends to a lot of everything else we've talked about, but just that idea of students needing to work on a farm or a factory, or maybe go on a field trip, to see what it's like and to hear from the workers. Like, I think I just imagine that promoting like a different culture of how we think about these different initiatives, like, and our relationship with them, it would seemingly promote like a shared some like a sense of sharedness, even if you're not working in the factory. And I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say working on the farm is connecting to earth and to reality in a deeper way, and it opens up your mind in a totally different way, and connects you to a deeper experience or meaning. Um, and in the factory, it's I haven't been in a factory, but I've had kind of summer jobs or things with kind of work of, I can't really remember, but not very inspirational. Kind of routine like. So, and that's a totally different level. But I think connecting to the earth is, I know about the youth training in Holland, um, von Werner Barford. He always sent his pupil, into the garden, and it was like they had to go on the farm or work in a garden for a whole year before they were allowed to start their youth training, which means kind of connect to yourself, because working with the earth, you connect to your own inner being, you connect to yourself, and that's the Voraussetzung, Nathaniel,
Precondition. Yeah, precondition.
precondition to enter, like, well, especially something like eurythmy, and to stay kind of in a connected way
Hmm.
to the earth and to yourself,
Hmm.
actually to your own self.
One of the things that, I mean, I definitely think that the like labor and working on a farm, being in nature can be a strong centering, grounding experience. And there's another aspect that I really am fascinated by, which is uh, the being able to think in processes of growth and decay. And like this is interesting because Steiner, like he draws on Goethe with associative economics. So in the kind of in European kind of tradition of judgment, it's not reason. So it's not the eternal. It's actually like opinion, or also the imagination more than the universal. But Steiner said this is the kind of thinking that really works in economics. Actually, judgments that don't last. And you have to get used to thinking on a farm, what you were talking about, Harold, with like, oh, the rain's not coming and I'm on a well and I've got to keep this crop alive. And, like, and all these things that are changing and absolutely contingent and they're going to change. You can't count on them. You're kind of in this field of dynamic forces of coming and going. And, Hannah Arendt in the tradition of antiquity, she kind of looked down on that, she, and also the private, like the distinction between the private and the public, the private was something that wasn't really interesting for the public. It's where you consume things and you have procreation and reproduction. It's the private household. It's where you take care of nourishment and all of these things, the domestic life. um, but like being able to sense how long a commodity is going to have value and when it's going to start to rot, that's earthly judgment, and to have a kind of thinking where you have like it's informed by life processes and not by mathematics, which Hannah Arendt famously, referred to as this kind of universal fulcrum point, outside of the earth that defined modernity, but instead having a kind of living thinking and living judgment in economics. And I just discovered this app. So this is kind of just like segue, like Too Good to Go is it's called, and it's an app that someone's developed where vendors and stores in my region here, they can put like food on there for like 25% of the cost that actually is still good, but because of certain regulations they would have to throw out, and they're trying to move it so there's less food waste. That's a typical economic problem, and like to grow awareness of this seething field that's right on the border of biology, which is economics, which is production, consumption, distribution, and being able to live in awareness in that rhythm. And I think on a farm, uh, farmers are really, they get a good education in that area. So that was another really fascinating justification from Steiner's perspective of why think in pictures. Why do we need to think in pictures? And why was Goethe's morphology or botany actually a great launching point for economic thought, because it's in biology and it has to do with this area of coming into being and passing away. Um, and it inspired also, which I always found I really understood it, I think, 2 years ago more deeply than I had before, why Rudolf Steiner thought that money should have an expiration date on it. Because if you have money that doesn't have an expiration date on it, it actually clouds your economic judgment. Because everything else in the economy has an expiration date on it. So if you're going to use money as a kind of symbol or, you know, for a commodity that you can exchange for commodities, it should expire too, so that you keep people connected with the cyclical processes of value production and value destruction, which we call consumption. So I also think on a farm you can get a good education in that area. Yeah. Are there any other reflections, questions, comments? Um,
Yeah, Nathaniel, I'm wondering, are you able to give a bit more context or maybe a reference to this observation of Hannah Arendt's about mathematics sort of being this universal fulcrum, I think you characterized it as, out informing modernity?
yeah. So are you familiar with her book, The Human Condition, which is sometimes translated as Vita Activa, I think, in some editions?
Um, I
Yeah.
know the title. I haven't read the book.
So if you read, well, the whole book is really her math. I mean, it's her greatest book in my opinion. It's a fantastic.
Okay.
And the last chapter where she makes a diagnosis of modernity, she pretty much explores this dichotomy between reason or the universal, which really, as a judgment culture, came out of the astronomical revolution of Copernicus and Kepler, as opposed to judgment, which was more connected with appearances and earthly life and cycles of coming into being and self-display, which Ashton mentioned earlier. So yeah, the last chapter of the human condition. I'd start there.
Well, I got a question to Ashton. Um, I heard that you said in order to search for this state of mind away from the buffered self that a lot of young people, especially in today's time, experience, you went out to meet some other places, folks, and traditions, if that's right. And I think huge number of young people have feel this urge to search outside for themselves, I'd say, or search outside for the connection to the world that was lost or is lost in today's time of our evolution. So what was your experience, and did you come back home and then were like, oh, that was it? I found what I was searching for out there, or did you find it in reading and understanding? I found it really interesting when you said you found Christianity. Um, yes, sorry for this blurry question.
No, no. I understood. Thank you. Well, so it wasn't for me that adventure wasn't discontinuous with my life prior to that. I just hadn't been in such a in a situation that was that different from my cultural experience growing up. But um, and I had had experiences with psychedelics before, but just not in the middle of the jungle, and not in the ceremonial context, which was also very um uh it was also very I just wasn't used to it. So I don't know if you can hear the yard work behind me, so sorry if you can, but um it's loud. It's just distracting me. I would say that as a result of that, can you guys hear that?
No.
Not much. No, no.
No? Okay,
You're
cool.
good.
I'll just do my best to ignore it. I definitely felt as a result of that, I mean, I already felt like the world was meaningfully structured at that point, and that there was more than the material world. But I just had no doubts about that afterwards. And I guess the effect actually it was complex, but I was a bit destabilized by the experience, um, because I just realized how much the buffered conditioning is like it's like unfortunate in that it has severed our relationship with the natural world and you know spirits, maybe you could say, but it also um, having a kind of like rough or it chemically induced experience of that can be destabilizing because then you're like thrust into this experience of other entities or intelligences without being able to really separate yourself from it, and it can just be feel kind of maddening. So that was something that I had a strong uh yeah, it had an impact on me, and I wanted to understand how I could have maybe a relationship with that dimension of the world without being driven insane by it. So, and uh, and for me personally, like a relationship with Christ is part of that. That doesn't like involve like a competitive like oh you can't like believe in these other or have a relationship with like the spirits of the land and Christ because they're in competition or things like that. And it's a big topic. I'm not sure how much I'm answering your question, but I've also yeah, there's this famous, I think it was Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, one of the guys who was involved with the 1960s psychedelic culture and then became like a meditant guru. But I think he was the one who had this phrase like, once you get the message, like hang up the phone. And so I've pretty much hung up the phone. Anyway, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I could do at this moment.
No, it gives me a hint. Thanks. Yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions? Well, I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity, Ashton, to work with you, and I really, feel a commitment to the ideas that we were working on, and it's kind of for me a vision that I feel is connected with modernity of hope. And if I imagine, a new higher education movement that is focused around a kind of a comprehensive aesthetic education, not just like a contemplative deepening, but also just growing more intimate with ecology, with the earth, with economics, as well as what we know already as aesthetic education through the art. I just feel really inspired and I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to work on it together. And I don't think I would have been able to get this book done without us going through that process of your reading, us talking it through every week or 2 weeks, so chapter by chapter. And so I want to express my gratitude, and I hope that everyone who's come tonight um, has been able to get a glimpse of the work and also what we've been working on. Often just the two of us over a table and a bunch of paper. Yeah.
What's the title of the forthcoming book?
Well, the title and the that was accepted by the press that's currently reviewing it. So they might suggest it be changed after the peer review process, but it's an aesthetic education for the Anthropocene, art, ecological consciousness, and associative economics. That's the working title.
Great title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where?
Well, I shouldn't say where it's going to appear because it's under review at a university press right now, but I'm not sure that they're going to publish it because the review's not done. So there's a couple academics that are looking at it, and they'll share with the press if they think it should be published or not. So I'll have to. But if you stay tuned to the youth section, it's going to appear this year. There's no way I'm not going to. This is going to not
Get
let
tracked
them
down
get this
further.
out, but I don't know with what press yet, definitively. But it's done.
I just want to say likewise, Nathaniel, it's been really meaningful to work together and yeah, just really special moments and meaningful to be working on this with you after, what I've finished and just feels like inform my walk further. And so thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
Where did you work on this? In Ghana or in the States?
And
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
Ghana.
6 months at the Goetheanum. Yeah. More, but we pretty much did it in 6 months. Yeah.
yep.
So I've seen you probably.
Probably. Small town. I'm back in the US now, but I just left, so
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. And Asha, I look forward to being in touch.
likewise.
Good night.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Adios.
you.